Hello, welcome to a tutorial on basically figuring out how to color or fill in shapes and how to use selection tools. I want to start this by saying that what I'm going to be doing here is based on some previous tutorials that I've done in getting some line work off of a site plan and is in conjunction with those, but should apply to other types of techniques and other things that you need to do as well. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you ways in which you can basically create color fields and how you can apply them into a drawing. And by doing so, it should give you an idea of how the selection tools in Photoshop works. They are probably the most important thing when it comes to using a photo editing program, at least in the way that we are using it today. And I wanted to give you a breakdown of this image that we're seeing right in front of us. As you can see, there are no lines on this thing currently. It is really just a bunch of color fields. The way I do this is slightly different than how others may approach it. The basic idea behind it is that if you think of these things as colored pieces of paper, so like this blue thing is a colored piece of paper, this green thing is a colored piece of paper, all these trees are different like colored pieces of paper set on top of each other, then that's closer to what my thought process is behind it. You can do all of this in the reverse order where you put your line drawing underneath and you start doing that. In mine, I put the line drawing here on top, and right now it's hidden. If I go ahead and click this eyeball here, it will come back. It's just a different way of working. This is different than how Marshall does and what his tutorials say. But the important thing to take away from this tutorial is that there are multiple ways to go ahead and lay out your layers, but the way that you select things and you start using them is really important. I'm also using this so I can show you what some errors look like. So if I go ahead and take this off, you'll notice there's these weird lines up here and this weird banding. That's what happens whenever you try to do things the really quick way, which can be good for figuring out if it's a look or a feel that you want, but at the end of the day, you'll want to make sure that these are not there so that they're not confusing whenever somebody's trying to read your drawing. Anyway, getting started. This is my entire basic layer layout here. I have labeled each of these things individually. A quick note on layers. The way Photoshop handles them is that there are things that are on top and there are things that are on bottom. You can change this at any time, such as if I want to take the sidewalk and put it underneath the road, I can. Currently that doesn't really do anything because my road and my sidewalk are basically the same shape. If I put it underneath the water, it still does nothing, but if I put it underneath the grass, it will disappear. So that's a pretty quick way of understanding how these things work. You'll notice that you can kind of see an outline here. This is because we are applying certain types of filters to our layers. So you'll notice that if I click the eyeball, it will go away completely. I'm going to go ahead and move that back into its original area. Photoshop handles layers by either opacities, which everything will have. So if I go up to, say, trees, you'll notice that the opacity here is at 45%. It means it isn't completely opaque. A good way to think about this is putting on sunglasses. If you have a completely opaque sunglasses, you won't be able to see out of them. But if their opacity is half, or at like 45, then you will be able to see the remaining 55% of what's underneath them. This is why you can see the sidewalks underneath these trees, and then it only really darkens these areas. There's also another way to handle layers, which is by changing the layer type. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this layer back on. I have this layer set to multiply currently. This was the original line drawing layer that we had made before. What multiply does is it takes the darkest color, whether it be black or dark blue or any of those, and it applies them downward. So if there's anything lighter than it, it will become at least as dark as the layer above it, assuming your opacity is at 100%. If I turn this to normal, you'll notice that everything goes away. So none of the colors come back. So You can start to play with these in order to get different effects. So if I had a normal layer and I change the opacity, you'll notice that it's coming back, but my line weight is getting lighter and lighter while everything else gets darker and darker. Now, if you're doing an animation of some sort, this may be kind of interesting, but for the scope of what we're doing, we're not going to worry about that. Multiply is just another way of Photoshop communicating information in between its layers. So if I hit darken, you can see that it's done this to some areas, but some areas that were darker than the line weight are now on top of it. If I go through multiply, it will do exactly what I was saying before by taking all that dark stuff down and like just pretty much adding it on top of it, much as you would if you were just like drawing on top of these colors. And there are a variety here that you can use. I highly advise you to just take some time to go through here and play with some of these. This is really where Photoshop starts to get powerful in giving you the opportunity to convey different things or to have control of your images. Multiply is a really common one, and it's used a lot in line weight, so it's the one we're going to be specifically looking at. The other ones I would really encourage you to look at, especially if you're doing highlights or anything, are these overlay soft light, hard light ones, where they pretty much just add a little bit of the color of the light to it if you want to like warm something up. We also won't be talking about them in depth on this tutorial either. So, with that being said, this is what the final project should be close to. There's still some things like the fastening in the roof here, as per the other image that Marshall has supplied as an example of a final version of this. I haven't done any of the shadows on the building. I've only treated the shadows on the trees. And my trees are actually slightly different as well based on the drawing that I had on hand. And then you can add shadows to the cars, you can color the cars, you can do a lot of things. The way I've treated the garages differently. I have slightly different approach to this, just I'm not as familiar with the building, or I'm starting to make decisions about the building that are different, like all of my walls are the same color as my pavement, and I'm just representing the roofs differently. This is one of those points in time where having a certain level of understanding of the building will allow you to move quickly, but also use this opportunity to convey the information that you feel is most important in your design. So this is what it should be look like when it's done. If I take the line layer off, you can see that I've basically just got these color shapes here, and if I continue to take off color shapes, it will get simpler and simpler. I'm going to start by basically creating this type of image. I'm going to switch over to one that's just a line drawing to show you how I set this up. Oop, there's already one that I did. Here is one that I have already lightened up from a previous tutorial. You'll notice that there are two layers here. One is this front layer and one is this back white layer. I just have this back white layer on so that whenever I take my line weight away, it stays white. It's easier for me to see. It may not be the method that you choose to use, but I find that the checkerboard in the background whenever you're looking at stuff is really, really distracting. So the first thing we want to do is set a base color. In particular, the thing that's going to take up most of our space is going to be the ground. Let's go ahead and just create a layer for that right now. You'll see that I click this button down here for new layer. You can also come up to layer, new, and layer to create one. I will go and create another one because I will use it in just a second. Whenever you create a new layer through this thing, you can go ahead and name it here. You can also rename them in the dialog at any time. I'm going to name this one water because it's the one I will use next. But I'm going to name this one grass or ground or whatever you like. You'll notice that these are now on top of this layer. This is fine if you want to just start coloring on top, but these will obscure the layers below them. I actually want this line drawing to always be here so that it's easier for me to work on it. I'm going to go ahead and select this layer and move it to the very top. I'm also going to rename it. I'm just going to do that by clicking twice, kind of slowly, on the name of the layer, not on the image of the layer. and I'm just going to name it line drawing. I'm going to go ahead now and set this to multiply. That is just this little dialog right up here. So if I click on this drop down menu, you'll see multiply comes by. Because I have no other colors or anything on here, it looks like absolutely nothing has changed. So that's fine. If you're at this point, you basically just set yourself up so that you won't have to do this later, but you're not going to notice any difference. I'm going to go and select my grass layer again. What I want to do is basically turn this entire rectangle into grass. Now, you could stop here at the curb, or you could try and draw the exact shape here. I'm going to go ahead and do the whole thing because it's just a little bit faster for me. You can either use, if this is perfectly orthogonal, the marquee tool by just clicking on this rectangular marquee. You may want to make sure that your selection here is just set to this normal one. When I'm talking about these, I will be talking as if this is set here. Just know that these, they're called Boolean operations. Do certain things like add to the selection, subtract from the selection, and then intersect with the selection. It would be worth your time to just experiment trying to get different shapes out of these for a little bit. In the meantime, I'm going to be using these. You will start to be able to use keyboard shortcuts to get this. You'll notice that I have this little crosshair here. If I hit Control, or if I hit Shift, correction, I'm going to just draw a box to get a selection. You'll need something in order to start this, so some selection. If I hit Shift, you'll notice it has a little plus sign. This is basically changing this into here dynamically, so that if I let go of the shift, it's back to normal. So if I make a new box, it'll just have that. But if I hold shift, it will add the box, which can be really useful whenever you're trying to go quickly and to just add things. Now, if you have a hole in here, you may want to use your Alt key. You'll notice that it has the minus, and this has changed up here. If I let go of it, it goes back to normal. But like if I had a courtyard in the middle or something of a building, I could do that, and it would take that selection out. Same thing if I have over-selected on something. That's the quick way to think about these selection tools. The other one to think about is intersect, where if you want to select something, you can just say I only want the selection on the right side. I can go ahead and do that, and it will get rid of the other things outside of it, but keep the ones inside of it without changing the shape of it. That's a little more situation specific. I wouldn't use that one very frequently, but it's something that you can do. I'm going to go ahead and select back to our normal selection here though. What I'm going to do is zoom in on one of these top corners. And you can start from the bottom corner or the right corner or whichever. I just prefer the top left to bottom right because it's just kind of how I think. You'll notice that it's staying orthogonal the whole way, going fully right and then fully up and down, horizontal and vertical. But you'll notice that I've got a little bit that's kind of left out here. That's because the actual drawing is not perfectly square. And we tried to square this up as much as we could in the previous couple of tutorials. But as you can see, it is a little off. While it's perfectly straight on the bottom, we have an issue here. For now, we're going to go ahead and leave it. I will show you a tool in a little bit that will allow you to adjust and kind of take care of issues like that. Right now I'm going to zoom out with Control minus. Make sure I'm selected on the grass layer, and I'm going to select a green. You can do this through this menu if you'd like, or as in one of the previous tutorials, you can find one of these swatches from whichever image you've created. I'm going to go ahead and use one of these swatches. This particular green here isn't too vibrant, and this becomes a personal preference thing. If colors are too vibrant, they end up becoming a little distracting. You'll notice also that I am selected on grass here, and I'm about to go over to this tool here. This is the gradient tool. In the beginning, I am just going to show you what the paint bucket does. It should be familiar to anybody who's used Microsoft Paint before, or older versions of Photoshop. This was the default. The paint bucket tool will fill an entire area or selection with a single color. I have selected my swatch color. You can see it's here. It's this darkish green. And I want to fill the selection with it. So I'm just going to click. And you'll notice that that's really, really dark. I probably don't want it that dark. It's kind of distracting and it actually makes it harder for me to read. I'm going to go ahead and change the opacity on this layer. Opacity is right over here on top of your layers. Make sure you have your layer selected. Click the little arrow, and then this is a little slider that'll move back and forth. And if you kind of let it sit on an area, it will kind of stay. And really, I'm not that happy with this green. It's just too gray. I'm going to go ahead and select a different green here. I'm going to leave the opacity at 57 because this one's about the same darkness. I'm going to go ahead and fill it again. That did not seem to do much of anything. And as you can see, it's very easy to start selecting and getting caught up in the colors. We're going to go ahead and move on. I'm going to use this color right now. I do want to show you the gradient tool also. So whenever we went to the paint bucket, it was usually on the gradient tool. We can go ahead and select that. You'll notice that up here, I've got an actual gradient of this really dark gray to what is now a dark gray. I actually want to change that color. In order to do that, I can come to color and select my tool here. This is a background color and this is a foreground color if you're ever Googling any of these terms. I'm going to go ahead and select this background color, come back to swatches and select this lighter green. You'll notice that my gradient has changed here. If you're noticing that this gradient doesn't change when you select your background color, just make sure you drop it down and that this one isn't selected. This is a really useful tool. It's your gradient, your foreground color to a transparency, which we will also be using later in this video. But what we want right now is just this kind of solid colored gradient from foreground to background. So with the grass one selected again, we can go ahead and add a gradient to this if we want to, starting with one color and the other. The way Photoshop handles gradients is you'll see this line that it's created. If you hold Shift, it will make it, at a 45 or a 90 or 0, any of those near cardinal directions, cardinal or ordinal directions. But these can be used in order to set a really smooth straight gradient. So if I just have the straight line, I can go ahead and just draw it, and you'll see that it has created this area up here being lighter and this being darker. The way it decides this is where you start is, say, your foreground color, and where you end is where it changes completely to your background color. You can see that gradient's a lot sharper. It doesn't really make sense in the drawing now. You can do this arbitrarily as well, like in a color direction that way. You can go the other direction. For our purposes, I'm going to go from the bottom left up to the top right, and I'm going to kind of follow the proportion of the drawing, mostly because we're going to be displaying this with the light coming from the top right in a 45-degree angle. So you could go straight 45. I feel that this helps elongate the feeling of the landscape though, since it's kind of a longer plot. Once again, this is a personal preference. But we now have our basic grass. However, all we've done right now is just add a color overlay to it. We're not telling anybody any more information. So let's go ahead and add water. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-D for deselect. You can also find this up here in select and deselect, although you will save yourself a lot of time by just committing this shortcut to memory. So Control-D. You'll notice the kind of vibrating background thing has disappeared now. That's fine. That means we don't have anything selected. We are going to select this upper area here. You'll notice that it is not perfectly square, so the square selection tool will not work, or will take an obscenely long amount of time to make it work. There are a couple ways we can do this. The first way I will show you will be using the magic wand tool. I'm actually going to select the line drawing, mostly because it kind of has the bounds already for us. And then I'm going to come over to this left side and select magic wand. This may be selected to quick selection tool. I prefer magic wand in general. It just seems to be slightly more accurate, more reliable. And I'm just going to select this field and see what I get. you'll see that the outside of this seems to be correct, at least in regards to the shape that I want. But it's picked up a lot of these flecks here. The way the wand tool works is it looks for all similar colors, and in the case of our line drawing, these are going to basically be white, but these may be particles left over from the scan that we still didn't get quite cleaned up. One thing we can do is we can decrease or increase the tolerance here. All that means is if it's close to white, it'll pick up more if our tolerance is higher. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 4. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control D also to deselect. We're going to try it again. So there's less flecks. You can invariably kind of just fiddle with this. I'm going to try 8 this time. Deselect. And I'm getting closer and closer to getting the whole selection. As you can tell, that this is not a perfect science when you're working with a drawing that isn't perfectly clean. Even at 12 it has that. And you can go too far. If I go to 64, and let's deselect, you see that it's actually gone and selected some of these lines and selected everything else. So this is one of those tools where knowing these numbers or experimenting with it, having deselect or undo at your hand are really handy. Let's try half of this. 32. Perfect. That seems to be completely within our bounds. Let's go ahead and zoom in on this just to make sure that it's getting where we want it to be. You'll see that it's riding the line quite a bit here. For what we're doing right now, this is fine, but I will show you whenever we start doing trees why this might become a problem. So I'm going to go ahead, now that I have my selection, I'm actually going to add something to my selection. It looks like this little particle here is getting in the way. So I'm going to go ahead and select the marquee tool because I just want a simple box to get them. I'm going to hit Shift. You'll see it's a little plus sign, and I'm just going to grab those. So they're no longer outside my selection. I'm going to go to Water, and I'm going to select a blue color. We're going to go ahead and use this blue color. And is that my... I want to actually make that my foreground. If you ever need to switch your foreground and background, by the way, there is the same foreground and background over here on the left side. Whenever you're in the swatches menu, this also kind of will tell you what you have selected as well. But you can hit these 2 arrows and it will switch them. If I select this here, I'm picking the background color. You can pick this from anywhere within your drawing, or you can just pick it directly from your swatch. And you'll see that now they're the same color. I'm actually going to make my background color a little bit lighter. Once again, this will be a practice thing where you'll get a little bit more experience with it as you work with it. So if I zoom out, I can now either fill this with a solid color with the paint bucket tool, like that, so that our drawing now looks like this, or I can make it a gradient. At this point in time, I'm also going to show you a kind of quick technique so that you can save time. So one of the things Photoshop lets you do is it lets you lock transparency. What that means is each of these layers has a transparency to it. And you can see that for this water layer, it's everything else. If you lock its transparency, you will no longer be able to color outside of this. It will only have this shape. This will be really useful if, say, you want to change a bunch of gradients without having to create a new selection, or if you are for sure never going to change what shape this is. For us, this is pretty much the only water in the drawing, at least to my knowledge. I'm not super familiar with this building, but this will allow us to just go ahead and actively change this very quickly. I want to do a gradient here, and because I selected my colors earlier, this is what my gradient up here will look like. And I want to basically just drag, and I kind of want it to be bright in the top corner there, but like not too sharp. I just want it to be a little subtle bit. I'm going to go ahead and turn this background layer on and turn these other layers on to see how it reads with everything else. And that seems pretty unified. It's kind of darker over here and it's lighter up here, but it makes sense. So this is a very simple way of handling this. If I did not have this lock transparency selected, which is this little button right up here, there are also other locks like don't move or no brushes and other things like that. If I didn't have that selected whenever I did that gradient, and I can try it right now, you'll see it'll go over everything instead, which isn't what we want. I'm going to hit Control Z to go back and lock that back since my water is going to stay the same. So now we're getting to the point where we can start talking about the other elements on the site. So there are the roofs, the sidewalks, and these other things. But the way that we're handling this now, and the way I like this method, is it allows us to basically just cover over whole things instead of having to select each individual part and make sure they all line up perfectly next to each other. So we're going to get a more complicated shape. I am going to very quickly just get basically the sidewalks. I'm not going to worry about the curb or the road really yet. And I'm also going to just grab the whole building along with it because I think it'll make it easier to read and easier for me to make decisions. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. So I have a new transparency layer. I'm going to go ahead and select this and call it sidewalk. And I'm going to start selecting. This is one of the more important things in Photoshop whenever you're selecting is to know the breadth of your tools. You have, of course, the rectangular marquee, the elliptical and single rows and all those things. You have this quick selection tool, which we've already, and the magic wand tool, which we've already seen. But one of the most important tools are the lasso tools. If I click on this, you'll notice that it probably looks like the circular lasso, but there's also polygonal lasso and magnetic lasso. I, in particular, work with the polygonal lasso all of the time. And in particular with these, especially when we start doing the sidewalks and the trees, this will become another tool that you can use to actively draw on your canvas. I'll show you what I mean. Select the polygonal lasso tool, make sure I have my proper layer selected, and I'm going to zoom in to one of these corners. And what I'm basically going to just start doing is clicking in one corner, and you'll see that I'm kind of getting this line based on where I clicked. If I hold shift, it will become straight, or go in 45, or up and down, just like some of our other tools. But I can select it a little bit more freeformly. For what I'm going to be doing right now, holding shift most of the time will work for me. I'm just selecting all this built stuff that isn't the grass. Ooh, boy. And if you hold shift while you get to the edge, it will move very quickly. And you can see I'm just kind of following the line work. I really want the line work to dictate what I'm doing here. It's the most important set of information in the drawing. And you can see where we messed up on our previous marquee tool since this wasn't perfectly straight. And see, it kind of gives me that flexibility to just kind of nudge back and forth here. And that's not perfectly straight either, or the corners were set at different points. Same thing with this one. And you'll notice that even though it's not perfectly straight, it's probably going to stay pretty legible because your own drawing is kind of in agreement with each other. So the drawing that you've just made by hand, you're now creating a drawing on top of it digitally, and you're using these kind of like guidelines. If they start disagreeing with each other, like, you know, not being the same bounds and things like that, that's whenever these things start to get sloppy looking. They start to get a little confusing, which is ideally not what you want. And you'll see I went a little bit too far here. You can cut back in really easily and then just go back up. But you'll notice that I have this really crappy little wedge out here. Just like with the other tool, you have these Boolean operations. So if you have it selected normally, you can hold Shift and you'll get a little plus sign. And you can just add pretty dynamically to it. If at any point in time you want to close your circle without having to go back to the point, which is kind of what that circle in the bottom right means, you can just double click and it will close it for you. Because we're adding it, it just added that little sliver. So if I zoom out, you can see where my selection is. And it's a sidewalk. I want it to be like a lightish sidewalk, so I'm going to just select one of these lighter tools here. Like this is almost white. I'm going to go ahead and at this point in time, you can either use your paint bucket tool to fill the whole thing in, just by clicking there, or you can start using things like your brush tool or anything else. If you do start using your brush tool, just be aware of some of the shortcuts and how it handles edges and things like that, because you'll generally want these to be pretty crisp. We're going to stick with the paint bucket tool for now. And actually, that's kind of yellowish. That's really not the color that I want. Let's try this color here. It's too greenish. That's too bright. So maybe we want just one of these simple grays up here. Gray goes with everything. That's a little too light, or too dark. You can start to see how picky you can get for each of these. So that makes this drawing for us. You'll notice though that I ended up selecting this area inside the grass, but I'd really, really like it to still read like this type of grass, so that that whole base layer looks pretty unified. All I have to do now is come down, and I'm going to use the lasso tool because it's kind of my favorite. And I'm just going to select out this area. And I'm just going to hit the delete key while I'm on my sidewalk layer, and it will just get rid of that area in between. So that reads a little bit better now. So I've glossed over a lot of different sets of information, like the stairs and this little post thing are the same. I don't know what this is exactly. It's not really important right now. As you go and start defining your drawing and as you draw them, you should be having some understanding of what these different things should be. I am unfortunately working off of drawing that I'm not super familiar with. But I do want to show you some other quick things. I want to create a, let's say, asphalt for this bottom layer down here. So I really want to quickly create a layer and then get a selection that only includes where this grass is, basically. One thing I can do is select the grass, and I can select outside the grass, and I'm just going to use the magic wand here. What I'm basically doing is selecting the transparency. So as you notice, there's this line here, but then there's this line here, like it's cut it out. What I want to make sure to do is select all of the stuff in the grass layer. I could have selected something in here, but remember, the tolerance for my tool will only select the certain band of colors, so it won't get everything. So what I want to do is called an inverse select. There's a special command up here in select, actually, and you know whenever they put it right up here near the top, it gets used pretty frequently. You can also remember it, Shift-Control-I. If you select this, you'll notice that this outside band has gone away, and now I only have this selection down here. But for the pavement, I don't want all of the grass area. I only want this bottom part. I'm going to go to this marquee tool again, and this is one of those very specific situations where having intersect is really good, because I can just click this and select the part I want to keep from this selection. So I can just come down here, get a big old selection, go right up to the curb, and you can also zoom in if you need to. And we're just going to check it real quick. That's a little off. I'm going to hit Control-Z and go back to my previous selection, and then do the same thing, but a little bit zoomed in. Good. I have almost all of that selected. And now I'm going to use the polygon tool in order to add to my selection, because I just want this little trapezoid here. So I'm going to use the Shift to get the plus on it. I'm going to come up to here, here. I'm going to double click to finish it, and now I have that selection where I want it. So for this new blank layer, I'm going to name it pavement, and I'm going to just select a darker color. I don't want it to be perfectly black, but you know, this is a pretty dark gray, as you can kind of see right here. I'm going to take this bucket tool and fill it in, and as you can see, I have now created a little bit of a pavement there. In reality, this would probably be the same color as this because they would make the driveway at the same time, but for the sake of this video, don't worry about it too much. So it's starting to read in a certain way. Now there's still more information you can put on here. One thing I want to show you really quickly is kind of the danger of using that quick select tool though. So like before, we were using that quick select tool to get a really quick shape. In this case, it was this really long one, and it came right to the edge of this line, which actually looks pretty good. However, if we want to start getting shapes with lines inside of them, we actually want to keep that area inside. Or we may want to include the line work in if we're darkening something, just because it helps make it pop a little bit more. I'm going to show you really quickly what a bad selection would look like. I'm going to select line drawing. I'm going to go to the wand tool, and I'm going to select right inside of this. You can see I have picked up everything but this line work. This would normally be fine. We're going to go ahead and put this on a new layer and call this layer trees. And I'm just going to make the trees darker than the surrounding area. So I'm just going to fill this. I'm going to hit G to switch to my paint bucket tool. And you'll notice now that I've done this and made it darker, and it now has this really awful looking areas where the lines below it aren't there. And you can try to fix this by changing your opacity so that it starts to match a little bit closer, but it's never going to look quite right. It'll either look too light or too dark. It won't look complete and unified, because what you're saying with the trees is that it's kind of just darker underneath here. This is where the trees are, and we're applying it to the grass, so it's still kind of greenish. What we want to do instead, and I will hit Control-Alt-Z to start backing up several steps, is get this selection, and we want to add to it. This is why I like the polygonal lasso tool. It just is more versatile. The faster you get with it, the more things you can do very quickly. And I'm actually going to zoom in quite a bit so that I can get a lot of detail here. And I'm actually going to follow closer to the outside of the line. I will show you on the other image that I had created earlier that was at the beginning of this tutorial why I like this in particular. And this becomes a bit of a stylistic concern, but when you start adding these different values onto stuff, your value changes start to become slightly different. And they weight themselves differently. Because as you add color, pure value does not have as much hierarchy in the information. And what you want is to make sure you're conveying the most important things you can in the most appropriate way possible. In this circumstance, I want the outline of this tree to be as important, if not more important, than the fact that the tree darkens the area underneath it. As you progress through the program, if you don't do hand draw trees, you can just get shapes and overlays, and you can start building a library to make this even faster, where you can just take simple set pieces and arrange them on a drawing. I highly recommend building yourself a library as you start moving through the program and into the practice whenever you start making these, just because it will save you time. And really, you can make some design decisions right at this phase. As you can see, I am actually actively drawing. I'm just using a lot of a guideline of a previous drawing. But every opportunity you have to draw or add information to something is an opportunity to make a decision. So never underestimate the benefits of doing this carefully. as well as making sure that you have enough time to make these decisions. Efficiency is not overrated. I'm going to just double click right here to finish it because I don't know where that ended earlier. So as you can see, I now have this all selected. I'm going to go ahead and take my brush tool this time just because I already have some things here that are selected. I'm just going to fill over it. So you've noticed now the lines get darker and lighter in relationship to the overall drawing. You'll also notice that these lines here look darker than these lines. It's because we are multiplying them together. If I go over here, actually this is the correct one, and turn all this stuff back on, you will see the difference between this type of tree and the edge of this type of tree. By getting that outline in there properly, you will actually continue to make these lines darker, and you are still affecting the line quality and tone of your drawing. And you want to be very active and involved with doing that. Finally, I'm going to show you very quickly how to do a shadow. In particular, a quick way to do shadows, because you can draw them manually by hand, which is fine, but I would rather save more time. And we're going to go back to this one. Obviously, I've worked on this drawing a lot at this point in time. So here's another tree. I'm going to just go ahead and do the polygonal lasso on it. Some of you may think that I'm not saving time here, but I think this time to make this line work look better is worth it. And really, as you start going on, you will eventually get quicker at this. And if you start using purely digital files in this, some of this will be nearly instantaneous, because you won't have the error between, different graphite. You'll just have vector line work or something that you can use that's much more precise and exact. But for now, it's a little bit beyond our scope. Also, as you move on, don't forget the importance of having a distinction between straight and fuzzy and all these types of line weights and colors. There are several different ways you can experiment, both with hand drawing and digital drawing, that can affect how your overall work ends up displaying itself. That overall work, can make some things feel a little bit more natural, a little bit more organic. Maybe you want to make all of your building lines perfectly straight and digital, or always use that rectangular marquee tool to make sure they're perfectly square, but apply these in a way like this to kind of create more of a fuzzier edge. It is somewhat up to you. I'm going to switch to the bucket tool using G. I'm going to fill that in. I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, but I'm not going to do it by creating the new layer down here. I'm actually going to duplicate this one. I'm also going to deselect really quickly. I'm going to right click on this and come up to duplicate layer. And it's just going to call it trees copy. I'm going to go ahead and call it trees shadow really quick. You'll notice that because I had the opacity of 82% on here, it just made this darker. If I get rid of it, it gets lighter. What I want to do is take these shapes and I want to move them down and left in a 45-degree angle. It's actually very simple to do, although I would advise you do this after you get all your shapes made. But I'm going to do this quickly since I don't want to draw all the trees right now. You can go ahead and select the tree itself, and you can see I can move this around. Now remember, if I hold shift, it goes straight up or down, straight left and right, or we'll go diagonal. And diagonal is exactly what we want. Remember, your spacing tells you how tall up the canopy of the tree is. This looks okay. Once again, I'm not as familiar with this project as I need to be, but you'll notice it's overlapping in this part, and this part is also overlapping. What I want to do is make sure that this overlap doesn't happen. So in order to do that, we're going to use that inverse selection feature that we used before. However, I want to select this layer instead, the actual tree. So if I select tree, I can just come to the wand tool, select everything outside, so all of the transparency, Control-Shift-I to inverse my selection. So now I'm just selected all the trees. I didn't have to hit each one of those individually. And now I'm going to come to tree shadow and delete. So it took out that one area. So this is close. Now it just looks like I have the same color, but like it's been extended. This is where messing with your opacities starts to really define your drawing. So if I leave it 100%, that gets darker, but I can't really go darker than that right now, so maybe I go lighter on the trees. That starts to look like a good shadow. You'll notice though that it has this little appendage over to the side. Once again, it's simply a matter of using your select tool, selecting the layer that you want, tree shadow. I'm using this rectangular marquee tool, selecting the pieces you want to get rid of, and then deleting. Kind of clean it up a little bit. And you can start seeing that this has begun to get a little bit of depth to it. We can continue very briefly, and I'm actually going to use the simplest shape on here to do this. This square boxy garage. We can also create shadows of this garage area. So all I want to do for this is create another layer, and I will go ahead and just call it building shadows. And I'm going to use the polygonal selection tool to start selecting the area I want the building shadow. Now, I could do the same thing where I select the whole thing and move it down and then invert it, but that would actually not be how these buildings are drawn. If you remember in your hand drawing books with Ching, these will actually create 90 or 45-degree angles, since our sun source is coming from that upper right 45 degree. So what we want to do is select the corner, and remember, if you hold shift after you have this, it will start going at the 90, the 0, the 45, your cardinal and ordinal directions. Be sure to select which height you want it. However long this is tells you how tall this building is. I have no idea, so I'm going to arbitrarily select here. And then we know that this is vertical, so we can go ahead and select down. And we're not quite there. We can always come back up. This is just like if you were using your 45-degree triangle to see if we're hitting that corner properly. So I'm going to go down a little bit more. And there, I've got that. And same thing here. Needs it a little bit more. Great. And as you continue to do this, you will develop your own means and methods in order to accomplish these same things. I'm going to do the same thing I did before with the selection. I'm just going to fill it with that same dark color that I have just kind of kept for all my shadows. And if I zoom out, we can start seeing that it's reading a little bit like a shadow. In this particular circumstance, I think I would want my building shadows to be much darker. So I'm going to leave that one at 100% and just lighten all my other shadows to like 72. And then I'm going to lighten the trees up a little bit more, so it starts reading more correctly here. And now that I see the shadow, I really don't want this pavement to be this color. It is too close. The information seems like it's the same. Maybe if I lighten this up it will look better. It does okay. Let's go ahead and kind of make it, I don't know, slightly more bluish, I guess. This is kind of purple. This is the color we used originally. And I'm going to go further this direction and select the pavement. I'm going to lock that transparency again and just fill over it. That's awful. That looks bad. And at this point in time, it starts to become really picky about what color you want certain things to be, and you want, or how you want them to be read. Actually, that's not terrible. It's too dark, but it's a little bit better. This is where experimenting and changing your color palette and all those things becomes important. But because I've kept these shapes pretty clean in association with each other, you can see it's very quick for me to just change them, whether it be this color gradient or this color blue. You can see that on this one, I was going with a more green, and this started to read a lot better, but I hadn't put the shadow in the building. But this is starting to read all right. In Marshall's, he has chosen to do this brownish color. It may be a dirt road. You might want to just look at other people's drawings to figure out a good solution also. Let's try one of these browns, see if that reads all right. That looks also not great. It's very pukey colored. Let's take that, but let's make it darker. It's starting to get there. It's too vibrant. So we're starting to get close. As you can see, there's a lot more information that needs to go into this, and it will take time, but my best recommendation is make sure that whenever you create your shapes and your selections that you get those right. And once you do, you can start making decisions about color and spacing and like if you need a gradient or any of those things much quicker. The final thing I want to leave you with is more of something that is personal to me. It is how I like to organize things. As you can see, I have a bunch of layers here. And it's fine, they're all labeled. If you don't label them, this starts to get very confusing very fast because you can tell by the images over here that there is not a lot of information that you can glean from them. But say I want to include all of my trees. So let's say if I had trees and like another layer called bushes, because they won't drop on top of other things, I want them to be kind of a separate layer all into themselves. I could go ahead and put them in what is called a group. If I select both bushes and trees, I can go ahead and come to this folder here, and it will create a new group. You'll notice they've kind of gone away, but if you hit this arrow, they're in here. You can name this to plants or something. You can do the same thing. I like doing shadows and highlights in their own folders too. Shadows. And then pavement and sidewalk. I can make this into one called hardscape. Etc., etc. And some of these, like water and grass, I probably wouldn't need to be in a separate layer. They're so far back on this that it doesn't much matter. But you can see we've started to build up in a way that is similar to this. And by all means, look at how other people select their colors, try different palettes, take stuff from other images in order to like get an idea of how these should start to look. Remember that as you keep doing this, there are going to be tiny minutia that will help sell your drawing even more. Look at the shadow on the curb here, how that really starts to help define this road. There's even a small gradient on the road itself. Shadow here, the steps and this wooden outcrop thing are actually colored differently, so we recognize them as wood. This is actually apparently water instead of a little planter. All these little things start defining that. The different slopes of the roofs, either on this gazebo or here, start to sell that. The parapet wall, this shadow. All these little things become really important details in your drawing that help to really convince the viewer exactly what you're trying to convey. And you can see that it becomes more and more realistic, or at least it becomes easier for us to understand what's happening. So you go from something simplistic, something closer to this, and slowly work up to a level of understanding for your drawings in a way like this. And this applies also to elevations. So this is my version of one of Marshall's elevations as well. And you can see I have landscaping, entourage. So this is the person and the highlights and the shadows of the person. the building itself, which is all of that. One specifically for the walls, for the different colors of panels to overlay onto them, etc. There's a lot of, and see, I've done the same thing with the line work on the top here as well. So this can be applied and used in a lot of different circumstances, and this itself is very different from how Marshall has done his as well. So go ahead and experiment and play with these things. Give yourself enough time to understand how these things work, so that you can start doing more, creative things, whether it's making the decisions quickly, like maybe color of panel layouts or something on an elevation, or just to sell something by making a drop shadow here that is blurred out, but it doesn't feel as harsh as the architecture, or that it kind of skews itself up to the top or offsets itself a little bit to match the form of the building. You're really, with Photoshop, kind of in control of each of these individual elements. There's a lot less here that is automated. So you have the ability to do anything you want, but you have the responsibility to control it in a way that is really, really kind of detailed and persnickety, if you let it be. So I hope that this tutorial helps you. I hope that just hearing me talk and watching me work kind of gives you an idea of a process, and I hope that you spend the time to develop your own. Make sure, as always, to save often, save backups, keep your layers organized, and good luck.